Thanks a lot. My title today is Thinking Beyond the Nature Reserve, and I want to talk about interactions between the world's crane species and agriculture and what can be done to facilitate coexistence. My name is Karoline Hemminger, and my supervisors are at Humboldt University in Berlin and SLU, the Swedish Agricultural University. When we think about how does agriculture affect cranes, most of us will have an image in mind that's somehow like this. And in fact, it's true, agriculture expansion and intensification are major factors in biodiversity decline. We know that both are leading threats to a majority of the world's bird species. We also know that bird populations globally have declined quite dramatically in the last decades. When we look at cranes, 11 of the world's 15 crane species are classified as threatened, and most of these species are also declining, which is of major concern. But on the other hand, we have crane species that have showed population recovery. And most prominently, we see the common cranes in Europe and also the sandhill cranes in Northern America, which have both reached populations above 700,000 individuals. And we wanted to understand what are the mechanisms behind this contrasting developments and how can we explain this. And to understand a bit more what you need to know about crane species is that, with some exceptions, all of them need shallow wetlands as breeding site and also for roosting at night. Most of them are also seasonal migrants, and all of them use agricultural area as foraging site to some extent, and the extent to which the species use agriculture varies. The importance of agriculture for cranes was also acknowledged by the IUCN specialist group on cranes, and they compiled this report on cranes and agriculture, which was a perfect baseline for my research. Today, I want to give you a very brief summary of interactions between cranes and agriculture, and it will be based on a systematic literature review. I only looked at peer-reviewed scientific publications, 216 in numbers, and then I will conclude with some implications for conservation and also agricultural management, and finally present some thoughts on coexistence in agricultural lands. Like I said, cranes have always used agricultural area. Prominent examples are paddy rice fields. This picture is from the Korean border zone, and we had a master student doing a stakeholder analysis there, and she's also here today and also presenting a poster if you're interested. And it's the case at the Korean border zone really illustrates its where restrictions of land use have conserved this type of traditional rice agriculture, which today is one of the only places where these cranes can forage, because in other areas agriculture has been modernized and is not suitable anymore for the cranes. We started out on trying to find out what is the importance of agriculture for crane species, and wanted to find out how much crops do they actually feed on. And here I present the results of the literature screening, and we can see only 7 species had quantitative results. And we see in blue the percentage of animal-derived food in the diet, and in yellow crops, and green is other types of vegetation. Just for example, the common crane, what we see is, depending on the season and also on the site, the diet varies very much. So there's plots, there's sites where the cranes feed only on crops, but other sites where the proportion of animal-derived food is much higher. So this tells us the species is very much capable to adapt to different kind of foraging sources. And there's other species where we didn't find that so much. But overall, also what's also a lesson from us, that a lot of, especially the threatened species, there's not much research available. But we also see a distinction between those species able to adapt, so the habitat generalist, and those that are dependent on very specific foraging sources, so the specialist. And also the dependence on animal prey is higher during the breeding season. Next, we wanted to understand what kind of interactions are there between cranes and agriculture. And we see here, of all the interactions that were mentioned in the literature, most of them were describing the crane response, so crane behavior in response to agricultural land use. This is, for example, foraging on cropland, on pasture, breeding in agricultural areas, for example, breeding in paddy fields, roosting and foraging in paddy fields, but there's also some evidence that cranes select their habitat, for example, their roosting stages on based on what's available in the landscape. I will skip to this one. So this is the summary. When we talk about intensification of agriculture and destruction, this leads to destruction of natural habitat, which is especially of concern for specialist species, and leads to population declines. On the other hand of the picture, expansion of agricultural area also creates foraging resources, and this is can create imbalance as the foraging habitat increases, but the nest site habitat and also the night roosting habitat does not increase. So when we have a population increase, for example, with the common cranes and the sandhill cranes, this leads to aggregation of large numbers of birds in a few areas, which then increases the risk for crop damages and also has implications for other species in the landscape. So what are implications for conservation? For specialists, I think it's clear that habitat conservation is still the most important measure, especially wetland conservation. This was a collaboration with a guest researcher with us who analyzed the the development of habitat quality in the Pyongyang Lake. And for generalists, I think it is important to connect the objectives of habitat protection with the objectives of crop damage prevention. So in a lot of cases, crop damage prevention is based locally. So scaring takes place locally, and also diversionary feeding sites are managed in one specific area. And what would be needed would be really to have a bigger focus and look at the whole flyway of the species. So not only have local solutions, but try to establish cooperations across the whole flyway, and also combine the objectives of crop production and also species conservation. And in the end, it's necessary to have the goal of balanced use of landscapes, and there will always be a trade-off between multiple goals of biodiversity and ecosystem services. What does this mean for coexistence? In this definition of coexistence, I think what was interesting for me, that levels of risk should be tolerable. So it's a question of definitions. How much risk is tolerable to a community? And if you want to achieve this balance between tolerance for damages and amount of damages, either you can work on damage prevention with damage prevention methods, you can try to manage the wildlife populations, or you can try to build tolerance and use several different measures to increase tolerance among the communication, among the communities. So my other part of my studies was to look at the effect of compensation on farmers' tolerance for crop damages, both in Sweden and Germany, and also I looked at different measures for damage prevention. So if you're interested, please come and ask. With this, I thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Karoline. Does anybody have a question? No questions? Okay, I have a question. How you had your tolerance and your the other side, the
Yes.
What was the other word you used? The damage. How do you and the cranes generally are migrating, aren't they?
Yes. Yeah.
How much variance do you find across their migratory path as to when you use one compared to when you use the other? How are you finding? Do you have to really go down to each place across the migration route and treat each one differently, or do you find that there are general strategies that work for the crane?
So I have to say, what the literature review I did was concerning all species, but my case studies were concerning the common cranes in Europe. And there I think the system that I looked at in Sweden is a diversionary feeding site, which is working very well. The only problem that I saw there, that you manage the problem on the site. So you have the feeding of the cranes, which prevents the cranes from going on the fields, but there's no connection to the overall population development, and also it might create problems that you increasingly have this concentration of all birds on one side. So that's why, for example, for geese in Europe, there's this flyway management program, so that really different countries along the flyways of these wild geese discuss about population management also, and also about the routes that the birds take. So I think that is what I tried to say here. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, please do.
You talked about trade-offs, right? Yeah. On the issue of trade-offs, what could be the ecological implications if you have to convince farmers to protect cranes, for example? Mm-hmm. What would you really be selling out or telling them? Okay, these are the advantages of if you protect the cranes in terms of trade-offs, ecological trade-offs. What's the benefit?
Trade-offs, yeah. That's also interesting because at least in Germany I had the impression that a lot of the farmers didn't feel a lot of benefits from conservation, but they were really more concerned. They understood there's a nature reserve, and that mainly it means for me to have more regulations and more makes my work more difficult while there's no really a benefit for them. So that could also be, whereas in Sweden, I think the cooperation between farmers and the nature reserve was very well, and they actually, the diversionary feeding, they organized together. So the farmers would be in contact with the nature reserve to tell them, oh, now we are going to sow our seeds. Now is a critical time for our fields, so please start your diversionary feeding. And they were also supplying the grains for the feeding. And also they had the benefit of tourists. Also, not all farmers liked the tourists coming into their area, but at least economically, some had benefits from tourists coming to the area to see the cranes at the diversionary site.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid